as I mentioned, when I was studying at Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California, and studying in the area of Christian spirituality, there were requirements within the program that I would take some courses in order to prepare for engagement, dialogue with another religion beyond Christianity. And also that I would take courses, and so to be able to engage within a discipline beyond theology and religious studies. So these were part of the requirements that I had to do. And so as I went over last Wednesday, I was in the area. I really thought that the outside discipline for me was going to be art history. And ultimately, there was a shift that I went through from art history to creativity studies. So this will give some idea of how that shift went about. But one of my first semesters studying there, I took a course at the University of California on traditions of art history writing in the 20th century, which was, looking at a variety of different art historians, a whole class that really, we would talk about some artists in the, when it came to looking at some of these art historians and some of the artists that they were writing about, but we were kind of like this class, really looking more at the other scholars and other, how do these art historians approach their topics? And of these, the one that I think really connected to me the most were Ernst Chris and Otto Kurz, who wrote a book, Legend, Myth, and Magic in the Image of the Artist, a historical experiment. This was a book that deals with society's attitudes towards artists. And so basically kind of a sociological view in that sense. One of the things that they mentioned is really one of the points in history where the artist kind of takes on a different kind of status within society is when artists start to sign their works. Then it becomes more, an idea of who is this particular artist, what do we know about them, and more of an interest in the artist and the relationship between the artist and the work. Here that the work of art no longer serves exclusively a religious ritual or magic function, that this is a point where there is something, beyond that as well, to point to the artist. Their thesis here is that the moment that the artist makes their appearance in historical records, there are certain stereotype notions about artists and the person of the artist. These are preconceptions that continue to influence our view of what artists are. Okay, so Chris and Kurz were quite influential for me, at least giving me the idea of thinking that's an interesting kind of thing to study. That to me, that really kind of resonated among these various art historians. That I think that's really what I'm interested in is the stories of artists and so forth. And really what it came to be is that within art history as a discipline, there's a great amount of focus on art objects. So basically, papers in art history um, are almost always related to analyzing a particular work of art. So there were times where I took another art history class at University of California again a little bit later, and I realized, I'm really interested in, what the artist was thinking. And this particular artist had some correspondence with someone who was also interested in their creative process. And I was really interested in kind of looking at the letters that they wrote between each other to kind of talk about the creative process. But the professor I had, really encouraged me to kind of do something that focused more on analyzing a work of art than the creative process. So that was a point where I kind of started to feel, I'm really interested in something that might not really be covered in art history. One thing that happened, and this is really, a turning point, and I realized it was a turning point soon after it happened because it really led me into a different direction, is Patrick Kelly, a Jesuit, and you can kind of see here some of his areas of interest: sport. So he studies sports. He studies the relationship between religion and sports. And actually, he came to St. Martin's in one of our programs called the Spiritual Life Institute, where we typically have guest presenters. At the time, he was at Seattle University. Now you can see, he's at University of Detroit Mercy. But when he was at Seattle University, he came and to speak at St. Martin's about religion and sports. And I saw his presentation. And later, I was studying, as you know, I was down studying in Berkeley, California, and I saw him. It was one of those things where, sometimes you see someone and you're like, he looks familiar. Where did I see that person before? Took a little while, then I was like, oh yeah, I remember he came to speak at St. Martin's. Oh yeah, he spoke about religion and sports. And what happened was that there's a professor at the school I was studying at in Berkeley who was also interested in religion and sports. And I thought, I should forward his contact information to the other professor that teaches here in Berkeley, that he is here. He was on a sabbatical, and they could be interested in connecting. So I went on to his webpage. At that time, it was at Seattle U, so here is one of the books that he wrote, Catholic Perspectives on Sports from Medieval to Modern Times. So he goes back into like medieval sports that are, completely different from the kinds of sports that we're playing today, but have some similarities. So it's interesting to see that. One thing, so I went onto his webpage and got his contact information, but also I kind of started browsing through. This is what is on his current webpage. Maybe not the same as what I saw back in like 2014 or something like that. But anyway, some of these I thought, he's writing about some pretty interesting things that I think I might also be interested in learning more about. And I actually met with him and spoke with him a little bit more about some of these things. And you can see that some of his articles have to do with flow. And so this is a concept within psychology, and this is one of the concepts that this psychologist, Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, developed the idea of flow, the psychology of optimal experience, most commonly kind of described as something that athletes will experience, and maybe referred to as getting into the zone, where basically an athlete kind of blocks everything else out and just experiences a very extreme state of focus that might happen during sports. So that is something that he would study. And also, he somewhat related to that, some of the core interests that kind of sparked some of his studies into flow and sports was the idea of motivation. What motivates people? There's intrinsic motivation and extrinsic motivation. Extrinsic motivation is, obviously people are motivated. Why do you work a job? Sometimes your job isn't really fun. Well, you're always going to be motivated. A job is going to give you a paycheck. Well, that is also extrinsic. It's something when you're motivated by things that external rewards. But there are people that are also motivated by something within, and he was very interested in that kind of thing, motivation as a psychological concept. So he also wrote then and studied, wrote a book that came from his studies in creativity. So, these are some of the things. So whereas Patrick Kelly was more focused on his Csikszentmihalyi's studies of flow, I became interested in Csikszentmihalyi's studies of creativity. So that led me to read more about Csikszentmihalyi. Okay. And as I was reading into creativity studies, one, they, I recall being in art history and really feeling like a lot of art historians were very difficult to understand. And it was kind of not always very straightforward with their language. And so when I came into creativity studies, I was very, very surprised at just how clear everything was described. And for one, there was a definition of creativity. And instead of having 100 different definitions from 100 different scholars, it really seemed like there was a lot of consensus on, this really is a definition that a lot of people agree on and don't really have to have every scholar coming up with their own different definitions. So I thought that was quite interesting. Creativity as ability to produce work that is novel, being new, okay, but just creating things that are new in itself, isn't always considered creative. It has to also be appropriate or useful or adaptive. You could also say, well, what about art? It might not be useful, but within a broader understanding of what is useful, art is useful if it is beautiful. That beauty has a use as well. So art is also considered to be obviously, that's how art is included in this definition of creativity as something that is both novel and appropriate, useful, etc. And in creativity studies, this field that is within psychology, creativity is determined by the field within a domain. So this I'll get into. there is somewhat of a common, probably even today, but historically, kind of a perception of look at these incredible artistic geniuses like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. And there's great emphasis on creativity just happens within certain individuals. So the kind of approach towards creativity that Csikszentmihalyi and others take is that creativity is not exclusively determined by individuals, but also within the context of the individual. So Csikszentmihalyi and others see the context as being the domain, which is a system of knowledge. So people eventually, creative people change a domain. It's hard to be creative outside of a particular area. The other thing about this is that they are also studying, there's a distinction they make between creativity with a capital C and creativity with a lowercase c. So there's definitely ways that people are creative in everyday life, but here they're talking about people who are creative that create work that impacts a domain. And that was interesting for me because I was interested particularly in art. But once we got into creativity within the field of psychology, they were looking at creativity in a variety of different fields, that creativity doesn't just happen in art. We can definitely think of creativity occurring in music, in literature, but also areas like science or math or potentially even politics. There's a wide variety of ways, or business. There's all these different areas that people can be creative. Moving from art history to creativity studies, I was basically shifting from specifically art and visual art to an area that was looking at creativity occurring in a wide range of different domains. And also creativity is determined by a field. So I could let people know that, and probably originally I would think of Albert Einstein, a physicist, as being very, 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 very intelligent. But within creativity studies, they also talk about Albert Einstein being creative. And this is something that actually distinguished him from other physicists, was not only that he was intelligent. Physics is, I think, an area that everyone in physics has a fairly high level of intelligence to understand what's going on. But on top of the intelligence, Albert Einstein was also creative. He thought in different ways that not all physicists were really able to think in the ways that Einstein was thinking of. Now, all of this, I don't really know because I don't know physics. But other physicists are the ones that let people know Albert Einstein is a genius. He is creative. He has made a breakthrough. If I look at E equals MC squared, I don't really see how this changes the way people view physics, just because I don't have the knowledge. So the field is often what determines. The field are the experts that will let people know, yeah, we understand physics well enough to understand how incredible Albert Einstein's views are. So then the evolving systems approach is that the field, the domain, and the individual interact with each other. Okay. That is a more detailed version of that. Here are some of the different theorists: Howard Gruber, Howard Gardner, Mick Csikszentmihalyi. The myth, they're kind of talking about the myth of the creative genius, the domain and the field. Okay. Okay. So kind of going back to like an example and going back to Chris and Curse, the legend, myth, and magic, they talk about the idea of Giotto, the story of Giotto. This is the story of someone who is the envoy from the Pope, goes out from Rome into the countryside. And I think I'm going on some memories of one version of the story that they get lost and they find this boy out there and they say, "Can you give us directions?" He gives them some directions and they say that this is what they're trying to do, is go out and find the greatest artists in the land and bring them back to Rome to make the most wonderful art for the Pope and all this. And the young boy is Giotto, who says, you know, "I like to do some drawing myself." And they say, "Oh yeah, let's see what you can do." And he just takes a rock and makes a sketch on another stone. And they say, "Oh, that's incredible. And they bring him to Rome. And the whole idea, there's kind of a myth of the artist can be just, you don't know where the artistic genius will come. And it can even come within someone who is a shepherd boy who might not even studied art, and still better than all the other artists who went to school. So there's kind of the romanticization of this. And actually, Csikszentmihalyi, for one, says this is a nice story, but isn't really how creativity actually works. There are these kinds of myths about creativity and so forth. So, I mean, actually, when it comes to Giotto, when it comes to art and religion, there's tons and tons and tons of art that is religious art. In this case, a lot of works by artists, religious works, and this is one of the works by Giotto, have been analyzed from religious perspective as well. Now, where I'm coming from is also, what about the spirituality of the artist? Not necessarily looking at the artwork. Obviously, this is a religious piece and so forth with religious meaning, but I'm also interested in getting to who was the artist, what kind of religious background was in the artist. Okay. So another theorist, this is a theorist that I definitely use just as much as Csikszentmihalyi, maybe even more influential to me on my dissertation than Csikszentmihalyi. Mark Freeman, a book called Finding the Muse, a socio-psychological inquiry into the conditions of artistic creativity. So that word there's socio-psychological, a kind of a blend between sociology and psychology. But you can kind of see how he does that. That he was a graduate assistant for a study that Csikszentmihalyi did when Csikszentmihalyi was at the University of Chicago, and they did a study, a survey of students at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And like 179 second and third year students. From what I read about these studies, they would do like a whole range of things. You may have heard some of these, like a Myers-Briggs I think that has to do with the being an introvert or an extrovert, perception versus judgment, or some of those kinds of things. Various kinds of psychological tests. So one thing that can happen, typically, people go and say, let's study creativity. Okay, let's go and study Picasso. Okay, we know Picasso was creative. That's great, but Picasso, by the time you come to Picasso, he's already an established artist. So you're going around and you're looking at people who have already established themselves as creative people. What they wanted to try to do was go back to is there any way we can identify creativity like before someone becomes a great and famous artist? So you can go to an art school and say, okay, here's students who are dream about becoming an artist. We'll do like psychological profiles, and we'll see if we can, if there's any way we can kind of know, from earlier stages that we might be able to identify who creative people are in that way from the beginning rather than towards the end. And this was interesting because this book by Freeman is when he follows up with this group quite a few years afterwards. And it was very interesting for me to read. I love the name of his dissertation, The Construction and Destruction of Young American Artists, a critical inquiry into the conditions of artistic creation. But it was very interesting for me to kind of see his book and the kinds of answers that the interviewees were giving about creativity. And in some of these, I certainly recognized quite a bit when they were talking about creativity being similar in kind of religious terminology. One says that when an artist creates, it's like being God in a very small way. And there's a variety of other comments from the interviewees that where I was seeing, oh, they're really talking about spirituality and religion. The author here isn't really commenting on that, but some psychologists pay more or less attention to religion. I didn't ever think that over the course of this semester, we've definitely looked at some theorists in religion that are actually hostile to religion. I didn't really get that sense from scholars in creativity studies, but definitely there were times where they simply ignored religion, that wasn't really their area, and they would just kind of skim over. But that was certainly something that I kind of saw. So that's kind of another point I think is to recognize is, at least in my experience, I came into a field that was not really paying much attention to religion, but that was something that I recognized was part of their content. That was something that I became interested in kind of developing further. So this was basically the premise for my dissertation, Fritz Eichenberg, a case study in the relationship between creativity and spirituality, talking about the creative process of the artist, the psychology of the artist, and the artist personae, basically how society perceives artists. And within this, here are kind of a variety of the different artistic persona that I kind of saw and recognized had various kinds of religious connotations with some of these, sometimes for the good, sometimes for the negative. And then myths of artists. One, this is an image of Prometheus, in Greek mythology, very prominent kind of symbol for artistic creation by being someone who steals fire from the gods and gives fire to humanity. And by giving fire to humanity, basically allows humanity to become creative, to be able to build civilization and so forth. There is the myth, various stories of Faust, someone who sells their soul to the devil in exchange for creativity. So sometimes you have these mythologies that portray creativity with suspicion that it comes from the devil, and artists sell their souls to the devil for creativity. Or from the book of Exodus, the story of the golden calf is and could be described as an art object, but this is very much considered an idol and is harshly punished for creating this. Or artists who have like a direct inspiration from God. This is an image of Hildegard of Bingen. The flames, it's kind of weird to see flames going downward like that, but the idea is that Hildegard of Bingen receives direct inspiration in this way. So these kinds of things. So ultimately, my theory of creativity, here is where I kind of draw from creativity studies. Some theorists, wrote about creativity and spirituality being one and the same. And so I had to ultimately disagree with some theorists and say, I don't think creativity and spirituality are the same thing. And it's important for me to establish that because I think there's ways that creativity and spirituality interact with each other. And so basically my theory is that spirituality can enhance creativity, but spirituality can also obstruct creativity. Creativity can enhance spirituality, but creativity can also obstruct spirituality. So kind of like 4 different directions. I could elaborate on a little bit more, but I think just to kind of continue to move on and see if I have enough time to do this. I don't know if I will, but then I go to another, my method being the case study method. That is closely associated with evolving systems theory of creativity, that emphasizes the uniqueness of a creative individual and so forth. Okay.